want to continue with our series looking at the geopolitics of different regions of the world. So today we want to look at the Far East. The Far East seems to always be in the news. With China being a growing power in the world, this region is becoming much more interesting and is constantly on the news. Here to discuss this all is Geopolitics founder Adnan Khan. How are we keeping, Adnan?
I'm good, Yusuf. I'm good. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I think it's been quite a while since we've sat down and had one of our chats.
It has. So it's good to be back here again.
Definitely. So Adnan, what are the key features of the Asia-Pacific region?
Geographically speaking, there's quite a few distinct parts when we look at the Far East or the Asia Pacific. So if we start from the north of Asia, you've obviously got the Chinese mainland, and then above China, you've got Russia as well. If we go further south, you then have the Korean peninsula. So you obviously got north to south for Korea there. Then you've got the Pacific archipelago, which we know as Japan. And then coming further in, you have Indochina. So this is the countries between India and China. So we're talking about Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. Further south, you've got the Philippines. Then you have Indonesia. And going further out, then you've got Australia. And going even further out, you've got the Pacific Islands. So these islands include the US state of Hawaii and New Zealand as well. So these Pacific Islands usually are combined. They're small islands. So collection of islands are usually how they're viewed. So you've got Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. And this region is probably famous for the international timeline is right in the middle of the Pacific. You've also got in the Pacific use of many countries like the US, France, the UK, and Chile, who have got islands there, which go back to the colonial era. So this is the features of the region. If we're looking at the people, Yusuf, you can probably categorize them into 5 people. You've got the people of China, the Han people. You've got a distinct culture. You've got the people of Japan. You've got the people of Korea. You've then got the people of Indochina, and then you've got the people of Indonesia, who are primarily Muslims. So the Asia-Pacific, Yusuf, at the moment is home to the second and third largest economies in the world in terms of GDP, China and Japan. And the relationship between these two countries and their relationship with the US is really what defines the region. So in terms of strategic issues, Yusuf, probably a few. You've obviously got the US and Russia. They are linked to this region, the US with the Pacific Ocean, and Russia is actually present in this region as well. You've obviously got China, the rise of China, which I'm sure we're going to discuss. This region has, since World War II, been the manufacturing hub of the world. So that gives a key importance to this area. This region also has key trade routes. And this region actually has the largest population of Muslims anywhere in the world. So these strategic issues, along with the distinct feature, is really how you make sense of the Far East.
When we've discussed other regions in the past, we've found that all of them were victims of colonization. Now, is this also the case with the region that you spoke about, the Asia-Pacific?
Yes, so this region also, Yusuf, wasn't spared from European colonialism. So the Portuguese, they first colonized parts of Southeast Asia after they circumvented Africa, after they had got to India. This is really from the 1500s onwards. The Portuguese set up trading posts. They defeated some of the local Muslim forces in 1509, and they seized the Malacca region, which is Indonesia, Malaysia. And then eventually they took over other areas. After them, the Spanish came. They funded various expeditions to circumvent the world. And the Spanish claimed the Philippines. They established the city of Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines today. And then eventually, use of the Dutch arrived in Indonesia. They colonized the whole of Indonesia. More precisely, it was the Dutch East India Company that colonized it. And this really went up to the 1900s. The British Empire also expanded into this region. So from South Asia, from India, all the way down to Burma, and Malaysia, all of these areas came under British rule. The British also set up Singapore, 1819. So, the Brits have a footprint in this particular region as well. And let's not forget 1839, Britain engaged in the Opium Wars with China. This is how they got Hong Kong. This is how they got concessions out of the Chinese emperor. And we can't forget Vietnam. The French came to this region in 1858. They seized Saigon, which became the capital of Vietnam. And this area, they were the one that named it Indochina because they colonized it. And then lastly, Yusuf, the US, they kicked Spain out of North and South America. And eventually America would take over Spanish holdings in the Philippines, in Cuba as well. So like most of the regions we've discussed, Yusuf, this region also was a victim of colonialism, and colonialism left its mark on the region.
You mentioned the US and Russia, that they're involved in this area. What I find interesting is whenever we talk about Russia, it's always in the context of Europe, and people might be confused and people might think that Russia isn't actually involved in Asia, even though it has a border with the Pacific. Why is Russia never considered as an Asian power?
Most of Russian territory is in Asia. Siberia, this area is all in Asia. Very little of Russia is in Europe. However, most of Russia's population is in European Russia, but most of Russia's territory is actually in Asia. But in that territory, you've got a very sparse population. And there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, I think for 8 to 9 months of the year, Russia is actually frozen. So Siberia is also frozen. And what this means is very hard to live there. So you find if ever you look at a population density chart, most of Russia's population is to the south, to the west of the Urals. So from the border with Ukraine, going up to about Moscow. Obviously, the reason why Russia had to conquer this territory was in order to get strategic depth for Moscow. So that's why you find that Russia hasn't really engaged in Asian affairs. You find it has a border with China. It has a border with Mongolia, but you don't see Russia actually involved in the political affairs of this area. Most of the time, most of the political time of the Kremlin is spent thinking about Europe, the Caucasus, these sort of areas. Although Central Asia is also important for Russia, Asia just is. And remember, Russia is really at the northern end of Asia. So if you look, you've got China, you've got Korea, they share a border, you've got Japan across the ocean, then you've got Southeast Asia going to Australia. There are interaction between these groups of people. With Russia, that doesn't necessarily happen. And that's why you find, although Russia technically has more territory in Asia, really most of its population is in Europe, and that's where most of its attention is. And in some way, this is similar to the US. Although the United States is located in the Western Hemisphere, an argument could be made that essentially America is also part of East Asia, because you've got America, you've got the Pacific, and on the other side of the Pacific, you've got East Asia. And America is considered a Pacific power as well. America, I'm sure we're going to discuss it, went to war with Japan in the past. So America has actually been more involved in the Pacific and with the Far East than Russia has, even though America doesn't have a direct border with any Asian country. It has ocean border, doesn't have a physical border. Well, Russia actually has a physical border, but it doesn't really engage.
So we're saying that Russia is not an Asian power mainly because of lack of population in that region, it freezes over, etc., etc. So who are the powers in this region, the ones to look out for?
So probably the key countries, you've obviously had the rise of China. We're witnessing that at the moment. But China actually for the last 100 years or so has been a victim of colonialism, and for a large period is actually isolationist. You obviously got Japan. Japan actually conquered the region prior to World War II. It led to World War II to really stop her. You've obviously got America as well, who's involved in the region. Then you've got these latent countries that could be powers in the future. So you've got Indonesia, which is massive in the region. And these are probably the key countries, really.
One thing that we find with these countries is that they're actually come together to form a global manufacturing hub. I mean, China is manufacturing, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Why has this region been the world's manufacturing hub since World War II? How did it get to this position?
You're absolutely right. China and Japan are the second, third largest economies in the world. Japan actually for a large part of the post-World War II world was the second largest economy in the world. And actually in the 70s and 80s, many people believed, like China today, Japan was going to replace America at the number one spot. So we've got to keep in mind that historically, global capitalism has always relied on certain regions providing inexpensive manufacturing. This produces a low-wage, high-growth country. So this is how the US developed. The US in the 1800s, it became a global manufacturing hub. It used raw materials, it used energy, it produced goods that the world wanted, and it produced it at the cheapest price possible. This is how America developed. This is exactly what China is doing currently as well. And after World War II, this is exactly what Japan did. It played this role. In capitalism, they've got this concept of comparative advantage, which is that you should focus on the manufacturing or your economy on the areas you are best at, that you do the cheapest. And all the other areas, let other countries who have got unique expertise in them do it. And when the whole world comes together, everything gets produced and gets to where it actually needs to go. So this region is actually played the role of global manufacturer really since the end of World War II. So you find the Japanese really after World War II for decades, they led it. The Germans led it in Europe as well. Now, Japan played this role really up until 1991, when due to an economic crisis, other countries emerged like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, these sort of countries. And now we see, since the beginning of the 21st century, China has actually played this role. What you do find now, Yusuf, is for most of history, you found that transatlantic trade was what drove the global economy. So trade between America and Europe. Really what you're finding now, trans-Pacific trade has outpaced transatlantic trade. And that's why one of the world's key trade routes is in this region. So the Straits of Malacca, which is the tip of the Malay Peninsula, is the world's busiest trade route. Roughly 2/3 of world oil and 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo, it transits from this particular area. And you find yourself looking forward, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, these are all up-and-coming countries that are poised to take advantage of China moving away from becoming the global manufacturer, and the fact that Japan's actually got other issues going to have to deal with. So having a low-wage, high-growth, high-export-driven economy is something global capitalism always needs. And this role was played by America prior to World War I, and it was played by this region really since World War II, and it still is.
Well, it's interesting that you say that America played that role initially, and obviously we know now America is the global superpower. So people may come to the conclusion that if you become a dominant economic power, that will automatically translate into now becoming a global power in the political realm as well. Obviously, that's not translated. It's not translated into that for the likes of Japan. Why did that not happen with the likes of Japan?
So it's not from not trying, Yusuf. Japan has tried to become a global power. Really, the pre-World War II world, Japan actually tried. So it's not from trying. And there's a number of reasons for this. There are some significant geopolitical limitations Japan faces. So to give an example, even today, Yusuf, 75% of Japan's territory is mountains and forests. The Japanese population all live on, which is what, 130 million people, they all live on just 25% of the territory of Japan. So what this means is most of Japan is uninhabited. And so people are concentrated in a few urban areas. So Greater Tokyo, for example, has a population of 37 million. It's unbelievable if you think about that. A city has a population of 37 million. Now, when your country is full of forests and mountains, it creates another problem. It means you have no energy resources. For energy, you need a certain type of territory, certain type of land. So today, use of 99% of Japanese oil is imported. 97% of LNG, liquefied natural gas, is imported. 99% of their coal is still imported today. That is a massive dependency, Yusuf. The Nazis lost 2 world wars because they ran out of energy. You go to war, you need industries. Now, before the US came to Japan in 1853, the famous story, in 1853, the American turned up with their ships and they forced the Japanese, you need to open up. And Japan at the time, Yusuf, it consists of different clans, which they call shoguns. These shogunates, these samurai warriors, they're from Japan. And if you look at Japanese history, what you had many different clans, and to protect themselves, they had warriors, and these warriors were samurais. And so most of Japanese history was one shogun, one clan, fighting another clan. And that's why the Japanese island, what you find, no one clan dominated the whole island. That's why most of Japanese history was closed. If ever you watch the films that they make about Japanese history, it's always about this land, very far away, very closed, and people go there to learn their culture. Now, when the Americans turned up, they basically said to Japan, either we're going to conquer you or you open up for trade, it's your choice. And this confrontation, it triggered what's known as the Meiji Restoration. And what happened here is the tribe that was dominating a chunk of Japan, they were overthrown, and the emperor was put back in power, and they unified the whole Japanese island. The main thing was what the Japanese realized was how backward they were. When they saw the ships from America turn up, when they were mesmerized, Yusuf, when they saw that America had intelligence using telegraph of what Britain was doing in China. And they were mesmerized by this because up until then, Yusuf, you know, when you're warriors and you've got swords, you're a muscle society. Everything in society is done by using muscle. They had no industry, no nothing. So when the Americans turned up, they realized that they are really, really, really backward. And they realized that they needed to modernize. And that's what they did. What they did, they realized is we need to become more and more like America. So what they did was they developed their petrochemical industry because they needed power. And this was an enormous achievement. So from 1856 up to 1900, just a period of 50 years, they went from an agrarian society to one that had industrialized. And the challenge of industrialization, Yusuf, is you need metals, you need energy, and you need minerals. Either you have this in your land, or you have to get them from somewhere else. So Japan's industrialized now, but it has no energy. So what does it do? It goes out of its island for the first time. So it goes to Korea, conquers them, and it goes to China and it conquers them. The conquest of China by Japan was brutal. So this is where tension then emerged between America and Japan, because America doesn't want a continental power, and Japan was on the verge of conquering the whole of Southeast Asia. So what America first did, they put an embargo on Japan, so they refused to sell any oil to Japan. And America was one of the world's largest oil producers at that time. And then we all know what happened. Eventually, this is what led to World War II in the Pacific. It led to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And then eventually, you know, it led to the use of nuclear weapons by America as well. So, you know, you're going back to your question, why they're not the global power, it's not from not trying. They've actually tried, but they've got these significant limitations. That's why you find after World War II, Yusuf, America didn't destroy Japan, although it did destroy it during World War II. What America realized, if you destroy the two aggressors in World War II, Germany and Japan, they would just become communists and the Cold War was starting. So what America did is it established Japan and Germany as two examples of successful capitalist countries. And definitely they prospered. Japan became a global economic power. It's a global exporter. And Germany the same as well. So Japan has tried to be the global power. Unfortunately, it has some significant limitations.
Now, let's talk about the huge 300 million Muslim population in the Far East. This is one of the largest concentration of Muslims anywhere in the world. What role do they play in that region?
So not much, Yusuf. You know, as we've discussed in the region, you talk about Russia, you talk about America, you talk about Japan, you look at China. You don't really talk much about the other countries because obviously with Indonesia, where 262 million Muslims live in Indonesia. That's a significant population. What makes us also unique, Yusuf, is the birthplace of Islam was Arabia, or the Middle East. But what you find today is there are more Muslims who are non-Arab in South Asia, in the East, and in the Far East. In fact, the Far East is where there's a greater concentration of Muslims. So there's a latent potential. There's potential for the future for development, for unification, for them to do that. You know, the future is in Asia. Power is shifting. You've got 262 million Muslims there. For the moment, though, Yusuf, what you find, unfortunately, the resources Indonesia has, its location, its advantages, these have not been marshaled by the political class in order for the country to play a role in the region and beyond. So with the Muslim, there's a significant number of Muslims there. However, they have not been able to shape the region because of a lack of unity and not making use of the advantages that are available.
We've touched on the Korean people. North Korea, it's always hitting the headlines. How much influence does it actually have in the region? Why is there always nuclear scares from this country?
So really, Yusuf, when we look at the Korean peninsula, there shouldn't be two countries. There should really just be one country because the North and South Koreans ethnically are the same people. They're ethnically different to the Chinese and the Japanese. Now, what actually happened is after World War II finished, what you found was communism began to spread in Korea, and America got worried that the Cold War was starting and communism was spreading in Asia, especially North Korea. So what America did is it landed troops in order to protect the American-backed government in the south of Korea. And in 1952, the Korean War kicked off, which the war, what happened, the fact that the war didn't conclude and a line was drawn, and the north of the line became North Korea, which was communist-backed, and the South of Korea became a pro-Western country, which is still there today. Now, the problem is in North Korea, so South Korea has become a modern consumer nation. It's one of the largest economies in the world. It became one of the tiger economies. It became a manufacturing hub. If ever you look at a map of North or South Korea at night, a satellite map, you see loads of lights in South Korea, but it's completely dark in North Korea. Literally, the evolution of both countries has been completely different. And what really happened is the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Il-sung, he, backed by the Soviet Union and China, he established a regime. And effectively, like the Middle East rulers, he established a regime for his own clan. So what he's done is, it's a brutal dictatorship. They oppress the people. He's made loads of promises, him and his family, that we're going to be this influential country. We're going to dominate the region. But the reality here is they are milking the country ready for their own ends, like you have in most authoritarian countries. So in the 1990s, effectively the country was in famine. The UN started providing with funding. And what the family decided to do then is, if we develop a nuclear weapon, that will give us more respect and that will actually give us more power. So they've actually pursued a nuclear program, even though most of the people are struggling in poverty. So the reason why North Korea does this is because it's failed. It's failed to develop the country. It's failed to deliver on any of the promises made to its own people. The only way to remain relevant and to maintain the regime is by acting aggressive on the international scene. And that's where the nuclear weapon really comes into the equation.
We can't talk about the Far East without talking about the Vietnam War. What was this war about? Why is it important? And could you tell us a bit about the participants and the outcome of this war?
Yes, so the Vietnam War from the 1950s up until the 16th, up until 1975, it was a war that really shaped the region. It still leaves its effect on the countries that were involved. So the Vietnam War took place in Indochina, which was largely occupied by France prior to World War II. Now, after World War II finished, America and the Soviet Union actually wanted Britain and France to give up all their colonies. France tried to reoccupy Indochina, but what they realized by that point is many of the people in the north of Indochina had become communist. They'd become influenced by China and the Soviet Union. So what the communists did is they led an armed struggle against the French forces that were trying to colonize it. That led to the war going on for a number of years. And what the US did was quite interesting. What the US did, they played a double game. On one side, they supported France. On the other side, they actually supported the revolution against France as well. So it seems what America's strategy was to create a quagmire for France. So in 1954, France signed the Geneva Accords, as they couldn't hold into the region and actually had bigger problems in other parts of the world as well. This led to the withdrawal from Indochina, and effectively Vietnam was split into the north and the south. So China supported the communists in the north, who became known as the Viet Cong, and America then supported the southern Vietnamese. And for the next 2 decades, the southern Vietnamese, supported by America, and then eventually American intervention, they fought a guerrilla war against the communists in the north of Vietnam. The problem is, Yusuf, if you had a map, if we draw a line from Norway down to Turkey, we come round to Iran, Pakistan, Philippines. That line was the containment line during the Cold War. So for America, the most important region in the Cold War was Europe. It was the area between Norway down to Turkey, because the Soviet Union had millions of tanks and it might invade the rest of Europe. What happened here was America just had the Korean War and there was the threat of communism. So like they did in Afghanistan, they've got involved, they've got bogged down, and strategically it's questionable should they really even be there, because the war in Vietnam, which is part of the Cold War, was just one little piece of a bigger jigsaw. And we now know one of the reasons why the war lasted as long was America felt by leaving it will undermine America's credibility during the Cold War. So America stayed in the war, knowing that it shouldn't be there, knowing that it can't win, because leaving would be even worse. Sounds like Afghanistan really all over again. So the US, burdened by greater contest with the Soviet Union, they couldn't afford to trade the security of its global commitments for one location. So eventually, in 1975, they left. So that was a big victory for communism. It was a bad loss for America in the end. And actually, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union then invaded Afghanistan 5 years later was because they believed, because America had been defeated in Vietnam, they were weak. So they were confident when they invaded Afghanistan. And then the opposite happened in Afghanistan. America bogged down the Soviet Union at the time. So the Vietnam War really was part of the Cold War. And I think questions still remain today. Should that really have been a war America should have got involved in? America was in multiple wars along the containment line. This was one little piece in the Far East, and that's why a lot of Americans turned against it in the end as well.
Have there been any other major incidents in the last century, I guess, that have kind of shaped the region?
So no, probably, World War II, you had the Pacific Theater, Japan conquered most of the region. Then you had the Korean War in 1952. Then you had the Vietnam War. These are the regional wide wars. You've had a lot of wars internally. So in Myanmar, you've had civil wars. Within China, Taiwan, these two countries technically are at war with each other. You've had it in Indonesia. There's a lot of unclaimed territory as well. A lot of countries took over territory in the past that they're still fighting over. So you've got other tension, but they're not regional wide. They're between countries or within countries as well.
The Far East, we probably find that it's really today dominated by the rise of China. That's the thing that everyone's talking about and thinking about. We can't really speak about the region without talking about China. How has China shaped the region, and what can we expect from China in the region going forward?
So for most of the post-World War II era, Yusuf, China's been an economic wreck. Despite China being in the communist camp, under Mao, China was a colossal disaster. So Mao tried to develop China under communist lines. So you had the Great Leap Forward in the 1958, then you had the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, and this just made things even worse. And for a long time, America actually viewed China as a paper tiger, big population but poor. So America didn't really take it serious. In the 70s, though, America realized it had the opportunity to divide the Eastern camp, the Soviet Union and China, because there was tension between them. And what we now know is, the opening up. Richard Nixon went to China and he developed relations with China at the time. So what you find during the Cold War, the US was able to win China over to its side. And this is really where you find China starts to develop. What China realized is communism has been a complete failure. So what China did, it opened up to the West. It wanted to get Western technology. It wanted to get access to Western finance, and it wanted to get Western skills as well. So China established its first economic zone, special economic zone in 1979. And in the end, this led to China becoming a global manufacturing hub. And that's why, because China solved its economic problems, now China can start thinking about getting back land that's lost. And now we can start thinking about engaging beyond its region as well. That's why China today, Yusuf, is laying claim to the region. It's building its navy, and it's trying to establish an alternative institution, an alternative order for the world. So in my lifetime, in 40 years, you've got a country that's come from literally mass poverty to now it's become a global economic juggernaut. And that's why going forward, America is really, really worried. China is the power in the region, and Japan and China have always had very difficult relations. That's why this region largely will be determined by the relationship Japan had with Germany. If there's anyone that's going to try and stop China, it's going to be Japan in the region. And this is why the relationship between these two countries is going to be critical going forward. So you're right. You can't really talk about this region currently without talking about China. China is a major player now because it's developed and improved its economy. And definitely, this is the region of the world we need to be watching going forward.
Adnan, what are the key long-term trends for the Far East, if you can quickly summarize?
So really three, I will say, Yusuf. First is the rise of the East. The West now is just one of the players on the global economic stage. It doesn't dominate what's the best economic model debate anymore. The West, if you look, they're struggling with mountains of debt. And what you find is when it comes to capitalism, people have a more positive attitude when they look at the Far East than they do at America. So you find when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to efficiency, when it comes to consumption, exports, people are more positive when they look at China, Japan, these countries, rather than looking at the West. Also, Yusuf, this year, for the first time in the last 100 years, Asia will be over 50% of the global economy. So that really shows you that things are really shifting. However, Yusuf, what we're finding is the increase in economic power is seeing an expansion of military power. At the moment, we're not seeing expansion of the region's political influence. And I think that's probably going to be the next stage we're going to watch. That's going to be the trend. So China does this all the time now. China believes it's such a major player in the world. Its economy is so big. China is the number one exporter to 130 countries in the world. There are only 200 countries or so in the world. So what China's saying is we need new global rules. We need new institutions. We don't need institutions which are dominated by America anymore. So this is definitely, the rise of the East is definitely a trend to watch going forward. I mentioned it before, the rise of China. The world believes China will replace the US one day. If China does replace the US in our lifetime, it will make this region the most important region in the world. For the last 500 years, the West has been the most important region in the world. So that's definitely something to watch. You know, whenever an officer in the army does a coup, his number one threat is other officers in the army trying to stop him. So if China wants to do a coup in this region, his biggest obstacle is actually Japan. Now, Japan colonized China. It was brutal. So they are enemies, although they economically do trade with each other. And the rise of China threatens Japan. That's why Japan is coming out of its isolationist policy after World War II. It's developing its military. There's talk of it developing its nukes as well. So that is definitely something to watch. Japan really is a pro-Western nation. It's a pro-American nation. And America's strategy with China seems to be to contain it. With India, with South Korea, with Japan, or with Australia, that's its strategy. So, you know, Japan, the rise of China, and the rise of the East over the West, these are probably the key trends going.
Thank you for your time today, Adnan. If you want to learn more about the issues raised today, please check out our website, www.thegeopolity.com. You can also learn more on other issues by accessing our website, where you'll find comprehensive insights and reports. I'm Yusuf. Thank you for listening.